Your choice arranged, the die already cast, examined, titled and ordained at last, Cam's piebald honours dangling at your back, esquire for reverend, blue exchanged for black. What cure to look for, where to ply your task? This the first question which you ask. Well, thus began the poet Edward Smedley's 1821 epistle to a young divine, the parson's choice of town or country. Assume that the new cleric is healthy, respectable, but not an aristocrat, and looks okay without necessarily having Andrew Scott's Fleabag sex appeal. Assume also he's not motivated solely by pecuniary ambition, but having only a modicum of wealth, is not so immune from material and social considerations that he could be, and I quote, happy if, estranged from men, he serves 3 churches in an Essex fen. So where then should our boy pursue his vocation? In town or in the country? Smedley's poem is quite clear. In the country. The author concedes the siren call of the city to someone emerging from the dozy groves of Academe. Shake off the catching slumber of the gown and pant to start a neophyte in town. There in the busy herd you hope to find all that exalts and beautifies mankind. But the city will disappoint. The non-noble cleric will find himself snubbed by the beau monde, lost in the crowd of the middling sort, and worn down by the sort of challenge of ministering to the capital's poor. So wide the wastes of sorrow that the heart grows palsied, dead, and callous to the smart. So vast the fold, the shepherd ill contend, sheep which but little on his voice depend. Now, Smedley's extended reflection on metropolitan woes struck one gentle reviewer, and not impossibly a modestly anonymous Smedley himself, as admirable, but a little hackneyed. It ended in despair. Griefs such as these the London priest engage, condemned to witness, powerless to assuage. Not his the purse which yields enough supply to quench the dropsied thirst of penury. Not his the counsel which can youth secure with want to wring it, vice at hand to lure. Now, this review was much more taken with the ode to the Arcadian joys of the country parson that then followed. The pleasures and privileges of cradle to grave and face-to-face pastoral work. The scenery, unsullied innocence at village nuptials, and ancient solidarities at the graveside. Sure, country living had its drawbacks. This year his tithes, the next his sermons fail, and now his squire is sour, and now his ale. 6 miles to fetch the doctor if he's ill, and just 6 more if he prescribes a pill. No watchman's rattle, and no postman's bell, and to thy glorious gas, farewell. And yet, with all this weight of petty cares, blessed is the lot the country parson shares. He labours for bliss above and tastes below such sweets as life's mixed goblet can bestow. Now, in venturing that the, and I quote, the author's heart, as well as his imagination, entered into this Drydenesque vision, the reviewer correctly identified the autobiographical underpinnings of Smedley's epistle. The Cambridge-educated son of a clerical Westminster schoolmaster, following ordination in 1811, Smedley got on by a combination of writing, tutoring, and clerical service. Having briefly assisted his father as curate of the Kentish living of Meepham, an agricultural parish of 900 souls, 5 miles from Gravesend, Smedley's first proper job came as a preacher at St. James, Hampstead Road, the funeral chapel for St. James's, Westminster. That's St. James's, Piccadilly today. This in turn was followed in 1815 by 5 years as clerk in orders at the Mother Church, serving a parish now with 37,000 residents. He rented rooms near Golden Square during the winter, but otherwise commuted daily from his father-in-law's residence on Wandsworth Common in the summer. In 1816, Smedley briefly entertained hopes that he might succeed his father at Meepham, that dear spot, but it was not to be, his disappointment issuing in a poem on leaving Meepham. Sadly, I turn my lingering eyes before the enchanted land forever flies. So by the time the Parson's Choice was written in 1821, Smedley had resigned his main Piccadilly post and was supplementing his diminished income by tutoring and writing for publications such as the British Critic and the Annual Register, and was about to become the editor of the Encyclopaedia Metropolitana, intended as a more religious alternative to Britannica, a post that he would hold until his death. From the mid-1820s, he was afflicted with deafness, and then, failing eyesight, an unsteadiness, to which was first manifest the brain tumour, which would then kill him in 1836. But he nevertheless continued with metropolitan clerical work as a preacher at St James Piccadilly until 1825, and at its funeral chapel until 1831, when complaints from parishioners at his declining powers forced his resignation. Temporarily, around 1821, he added an additional job, this time as evening lecturer at Camberwell. Deceptively suburban, but already a parish with some 18,000 inhabitants. Smedley thus never achieved his goal of a country living, though his final residence at Dulwich at least allowed him to do occasional country walks. Now, Smedley's biographer describes his employment at St James's as, and I quote, an office of moderate emolument and considerable labour. He preached weekly on Sundays at either Mother Church or the chapel, and during the week engaged in pastoral work across the populous and in many parts impoverished parish. His colleague and successor at Hampstead Road, Henry Stebbing, would later claim to have personally conducted some 450 funerals a year. And this workload was matched in other contemporary inner-city parishes. At St Matthew's, Bethnal Green, population 45,000 in 1821 and rising, in the late 1820s, its curate, Patsy Kensit's ancestor, James Main, annually performed some 800 christenings, 180 marriages, and 670 funerals. Yet London clergy were not uniquely overburdened. The chaplains of Manchester Parish Church shouldered but also profited from staggering numbers of rites of passage, where one individual alone in his career baptised 23,211 children, married 13,186 couples, and buried almost 10,000 parishioners. So in the early 19th century, urban clergy shouldered heavy workloads even before pastoral visiting and outreach, not universal but not unusual, were taken into account. So that Smedley favours the country over the town as a clerical job probably doesn't surprise you. Nor to anyone familiar with Victorian church history will these details of urban parochial work. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, both contemporary commentators and historians presented the city and its residents as the main obstacle to the Anglican Church's claims to be a national church, not only in name, but in terms of allegiance, and more generally as the front line in a wider battle between organised religion on the one hand and unbelief on the other. And one milestone in this identification was the civil servant Horace Mann's influential interpretation of Britain's first, and for long only, religious census conducted in 1851. Not coincidentally, the first year in which most Englishmen were classified as living in the town rather than the countryside in a census. And this diagnosed a worrying failure of Christianisation of the city, which demanded a missionary effort not unlike them being undertaken in so-called heathen lands overseas. But by a nice coincidence, The year of Smedley's poem, 1821, saw the publication of another significant landmark in the literature of British city Christianity. The Christian and civic economy of large towns by the Glasgow evangelical and political economist Thomas Chalmers mounted a much-needed defence of church establishment on which Anglicans would rely for the next half-century, presenting it as the only system capable of delivering religion and so morality to the teeming masses of the city. He said, unless you had the state backing the church, there simply wouldn't be the money needed to do the work of the church in the city. And the city remains at the heart of more recent appraisals of Anglican clerical achievement or effort. For an outstanding generation of historians of Victorian and Edwardian religion, the seriousness or otherwise of interventions can be judged by the degree to which they identified and addressed the most daunting challenges as lying in the 19th century city, whose social problems were simultaneously, as at the time these people were writing, being investigated by social historians of a Marxist style. Even now, as many postmodernist historians are pushing back the key decades in the story of secularization to the 1960s, which we now tend to see as the most important decade for the loss of widespread religion in Britain, just with more, they're beginning to re-examine what the Victorian church was doing in light of that. But they're still saying that the only way you can judge success or failure is by looking at the city, because that's where the action was. There's more appreciation of the work that was being done, and more appreciation of the importance of church building, which is often seen as a waste of money in the past. But that rehabilitation of the Anglican urban mission remains absolutely central to what historians have been writing about religion in Victorian Britain. Now, in this talk, what I want to do is use Smedley's poem as a starting point to explore the pastoral challenge of the City of London through a slightly unusual lens, that of the clergy themselves, an approach that reflects some 20 years of work I've devoted to the clergy of the Church of England database, 1540 to 1835. This is a project I've been working on since the late 1990s, which includes every clerical career event from 1540 to 1835 in England and Wales. It's online, it's free of access, it's searchable. So if you're looking for a clergyman for local history, this is a good place to go. It has about 1.5 million records in it. Now, by the late 19th century, there were a range of very familiar models available to Anglican clergy against which they could judge their success as a London clergyman. Heroic or naive failures or hypocritical shirkers. There were all kinds of scales in which you could be judged as a success or failure. And there were three particular models that were very influential. There was first the idea of an often ritualist, high church slum priest who might expire from a disease acquired in the course of his duties or be expelled from his work by a bishop or congregation unsympathetic to his belief that Catholic ritual spoke in a uniquely effective way to the working class. And we find a lot of that in the East End of London. Around Bethnal Green in the 1830s and 40s, someone said, was I going to mention Brian King? Brian King would come in at this point, someone who provoked riots in St George's in the East with his approach in this way. A second type was the evangelical street missioner, parodied in Michael Palin's film The Missionary, spreading the word in often rather unpromising circumstances. Now, both types of clerics might supplement their pastoral efforts with significant engagement with the war against vice in the form of educational, recreational, or sporting social work. Go to the East End, you'll see the boxing clubs, you'll see the gyms, the YMCAs that were part of that story. A third, more liberal model in character seemed to unsympathetic observers to almost abandon religion entirely in its efforts to engage the poor. It talked only about morality and fitness rather than about sin. And nonetheless, it sought to make the Christian offer more relevant to a working class that had no prior knowledge of religion. So a broad church, liberal church approach. Now, all these three models were united by a perception that the urban posts were especially laborious and probably thankless. They required specialist techniques that you couldn't pick up in the countryside. They were poorly paid and undesirable to anyone except the most motivated. They were staffed by a different kind of gentleman, as one person put it, if they were gentlemen at all. And equipped with this understanding, newly ordained clerics could deliberately choose or try to avoid or recognise the inevitability of a career as an urban clergyman. However, the long time frame of the Clergy Database Project constantly reveals that things that we take for granted in one particular period of specialism are not historical constants, but highly specific to time and place. And one of these, it turns out, is the assumption that the town challenge, the urban challenge, the London challenge, is a uniquely demanding one for a clerical professional. So when did this idea emerge, especially so far as it was current among the clergy? And to what wider story of the understanding of city ministry in the Anglican Church did they contribute? How did clerics, other than Smedley, decide between town and country? And did they even conceptualise the choice in these terms? If they did, how did they determine which category a particular post belonged to? Historians up to now have told us far more about how clergy tackled the urban challenge in the late 19th century than earlier, and generally more about the response to the city in terms of church building than changing clerical understandings of what the task of the city was. This has been written about how the clergy framed the city as a career option and what sort of folk took it up. And if that's so, it's partly because of all the academic interest in the urban front line, elsewhere the country parson remains the favoured stereotype of the Anglican vicar. Think only of how the Vicar of Dibley became a BBC One hit, whereas Rev was at least at first envisaged as a niche pleasure for BBC Two. And that, of course, reflects wider issues about the relative place of town and country in ideas of Englishness, that quite often we think of Englishness as relating to the countryside rather than the city. And consequently, there's many ramifications I won't have time to talk about tonight in terms of that wider story about Englishness. But I hope I can offer some useful first thoughts on this topic, which I want to take further, but I may be confined to raising questions rather than providing answers at various points in what I want to say. So if I want to suggest that there was a new conception of what it meant to be a London clergyman in place by the end of the 19th century, I've got to begin by exploring the idea of an old understanding that it might have replaced. So if that was, this demanding vision was there, what did people think before the 19th century? And that might seem an easy task, given that the idea of the non-urban clergyman, or the country parson, is such an enduring idea in English literature and art. You might assume that that concept, which in the 18th century collections online forms part of the title of no fewer than 50 separate publications, which include the words country clergyman or country parson in them, had an equally distinct antithesis. But no, not one publication in 18th century collections online contains either town or city parson in its title, or any identifiable synonymous phrase, save for one letter to a city clergyman of 1711, which uses it only to disguise the identity of the recipient. It doesn't do anything with the idea that it's to a city clergyman. The country parson's ubiquity derives from its use in George Herbert's classic clerical professional handbook of 1632, A Priest to the Temple or Country Parson. So it's instructive to look at what Herbert actually says about the country parson here. And we find actually that he's not talking about country parsons at all. For Herbert, country parson just means anyone who's a parish clergyman. It's distinguished not from an explicitly urban alternative, but from clerics inhabiting either universities or noble households. So this is court and country, not town and country, that's operating here. And for the next 150 years, none of those who followed Herbert in offering advice to their professional colleagues saw any need to depart from this precedent. A whole series of 18th century handbooks on the clerical profession made no specific prescriptions at all for how to approach a town or city living, deploying country parson in their title, but nevertheless addressing the whole profession. as in the publication of 1725, The Country Parson's Companion or A Young Clergyman's Lawyer. Nor was there any advice on the challenges or rewards of the town in other texts to which clerics turned for advice, such as Gilbert Burnet's famous Pastoral Care of 1692 and Thomas Wilson's Paracolia. This was so even when the intended audiences might be presumed to be in the particular need of such advice. So, for example, Bishop Edmund Gibson of London addressed his clergy in 1724. But again, he doesn't say anything about what they should do because they're London clergy. Indeed, even Thomas Chalmers, in that book I showed you earlier, saying that the challenge of the large town, what's his solution to the challenge of the large town? He says, try and reproduce the country parish. It's the only way to get everybody involved. And the problem with the city is that people haven't been trying hard enough to make them work like the countryside. So in that sense, it really is very hard to find anything that talks about what it was to be a town clergyman or London clergyman in the 18th century. So if we can't find him in advice literature, we're going to have to look elsewhere. We can look for a start to whether other authors, other historians have tried to say anything about London clergy in the past. And there's one that does so in far back as 1848. In his History of England, Thomas Macaulay contrasts the rural clergy of the 1680s with those of London, university and cathedral cities. The latter are men of parts, the former a socially inferior, marginalised plebeian class until late Hanoverian land values rise and restore their social standing. And I quote, "Assuredly, there was at that time no lack in the English church of ministers distinguished by abilities and learning. These ministers were not scattered among the rural population. They were brought together at a few places where the means of acquiring knowledge were abundant and where the opportunities of vigorous intellectual exercise were frequent. These eminent men were to be found with scarcely a single exception at the universities, at the great cathedrals, or in the capital." Now, where did Macaulay get this idea? Well, one source that we find from his footnotes was the Restoration clerical satirist John Eachard, whose Grounds and Occasions of the Contempt of the Clergy of 1670 contrasted the very learned and judicious persons saving the souls of city officials, aldermen and merchants with the much less impressive clerics assigned to the rural poor. And this emphasis on the audience of the town cleric also appears in a work penned at the other end of the long 18th century, but taking a rather different line. In 1794, the Staffordshire evangelical Thomas Gisborne, a key figure in the Clapham sect, penned a 2-volume work on the duties of men in the higher and middle classes in society in Great Britain. And part of this work discusses the clerical profession. And in this section, Gisborne highlighted distinctive moral perils facing the town cleric, conspicuousness of station, foppishness and showing off, and the contagion of more refined luxuriousness of living. It was dangerous to be a town clergyman for Gisborne. Now, if you can take away that slightly pejorative tone that Gisborne's using there, he perhaps provides the nearest thing we can find to a stereotype of the city clergyman of around 1800, one echoed in Smedley's description of the hopes that might initially attract a newly ordained cleric into mistakenly choosing the town. And indeed Chalmers, who noted the impulse to intellectual activity that the town offered. The city here is clearly that of the 18th century urban renaissance, not that of the early industrial revolution. It's a town populated by the beau monde and an elite up in town, above all in London, for the season, not one defined by its impoverished working classes. And rather than posing the clergyman a pastoral challenge, it offers opportunity. The moral peril emphasises not that of the unchurched poor, but the one that faces the clergyman himself. This is a London where the cleric is more likely to be observed in the pleasure garden than in the slum. Now, when Gisborne was writing this, probably it reflected more than a vague evangelical suspicion of the perils of polite society, because I suspect fresh in his mind was the memory of the morally compromised and notorious London cleric Dr. William Dodd, the macaroni parson, executed for forgery at Tyburn in 1777. Dodd had moved to London before ordination, already incurring some of the debts that determined his fate. He served as a curate in West Ham and then became a popular and fashionable preacher in the city churches, his reputation earning him a royal chaplaincy. After winning the lottery, he helped finance a proprietary chapel, i.e. a self-sustaining business enterprise church in Pimlico, before he was in disgrace for bribing his way into the living of St George's, Hanover Square. Dodd's London ministry had been a round of charitable and other sermons for the rich, often female audiences, many of whom rallied to his defence as he faced execution. However, although Dodd was a London incumbent, it's unlikely that perceptions of London clergy derived from observations of the clergy like him. I suspect it was more about the clergy who were visible in the city rather than those who actually ministered to it. And in London, many of the most visible, either in person or in print, were probably not London clergymen at all. The seasonal elite migration that developed following the institution of regular parliamentary sittings that created the London season and the beau monde that enjoyed it. If you've never read Hannah Gregg's wonderful book about the beau monde in London this period, I do recommend it to you. That had clerical consequences. Lords descending on London brought along their domestic chaplains, not only to conduct their domestic services, but to share walks, dinners, and visits to coffee houses and taverns, or to act as substitute hosts in their London residences. And with more than 70 aristocratic chaplains appointed each year in the 18th century, and each member of the royal family employing up to 48 each, these chaplains must have been a highly visible part of the London social scene. The 27 bishops, too, in town for Parliament would bring with them their own chaplains, not least for the ordinations, which in turn would summon a considerable, if even more transient body of clergy to London to get ordained. The presence of the elite also made London the centre for charitable and occasional sermons whose celebrity preachers were drawn from a wide pool and inevitably received more public attention than the weekly preaching of the parish churches in London. At both St Paul's and Westminster Abbey, the cycle of canonical residence and preaching would again bring in yet more clerical short-term residents. Now, at first sight, these transient clergy coming to London might have a less clear-cut London identity than others. As vicars or rectors, they might well hold livings in the countryside rather than in the city. But it's important to remember that was equally true of the London parish clergy. This map indicates livings held by a selection of London ministers in 1780 at the same time as they held down their jobs in London. And looking at it, you can see that few of these on the map could unambiguously be described as London clergy or even as urban clergy, because their other livings tended to be in the heart of the English countryside, often at considerable distance from their London position. The same was true if you look at where they'd been born. So I've avoided the city churches here because there are just too many of them, and that's my next part of this project. But I did try and find out where the clergy had been born in 1780, who were ministering to the main inner-city parishes. You can see they come from quite a wide range of backgrounds. One from Scotland, quite a few from the Midlands, quite a few from outside London altogether. Now, this blurring may have been one factor inhibiting the emergence of a distinct discussion about the duties of an urban clergy, because there were no distinctively urban clergy to take that advice. And it was compounded, I think, by the habit of many 18th century country clergy of taking up residence not in their sometimes dilapidated rectories or vicarages in the countryside, but in the nearest town they could find, they could get decent lodgings. Developing what used to be called rookeries, groups of clergy living in town who would then go out and work in the countryside rather than actually live there. In terms of those employed exclusively in London benefices, the lecturers and curates who assisted the London rectors and vicars were much less visible than those that we've been discussing. And perhaps the most prominent of these people who really were London clergy were those associated with the growing number of proprietary chapels, these free enterprise churches where people set up and paid for the building and for their income simply by people buying pews to come and listen to them preach. So a celebrity preacher would just get, well, like an American evangelical church today. People were paying to come and listen to a particular preacher. And these became much more common in London, particularly as the West End grew up. So you find a lot in Westminster, you find them out as it moves into Kensington, and that develops these free enterprise preaching houses where people just set up and sustain themselves with their own sermonising. And these catered exclusively to the well-heeled, because you had to be able to buy a pew in them. Here the urban clergyman could polish his urbane persona while preaching to the unconverted, and with luck rake off sufficient profits to maintain the lifestyle which the best venue suggested, all in a manner which in its commercial and speculative dimension afforded prime ammunition for those critical of London's impact on clerical behaviour. Now, the mental association of the London cleric with attending the elite rather than the poor probably ensured that the Georgian Parson understood London rather differently from his Victorian successor. Through late 19th century spectacles, for example, a map of London parishes might have come into focus in the following way. They're in a textual rather than in a topographic form. So here's his classification of London parishes by the number of people you would be responsible for if you took it on. And you can see that the numbers are huge, particularly in the north central part of the town, around about St Pancras, where there were just huge numbers of people that you were responsible for. And in late Victorian, the first thing they'd say about their parish is, I've got X thousand parishioners. That was how you judged the challenge or the scale of the task that you took on. So that's a Victorian perspective on it, I think. But I suspect the Hanoverian cleric understood the city in rather different ways. One way might be, who do I need to ask for a job, or who could get me a job in London? And this map shows you who you could go to get a post in London. And striking in the number of Oxford and Cambridge colleges that were controlling living, particularly in the East End. So Bethnal Green was Brasenose College, Oxford, for a whole series of livings there that decided who the vicar was going to be. The Bishop of London was quite important. St Paul's Cathedral or Winchester Cathedral were also players in this game. And I think that might be one of the first things you knew about the job you were going for. Who could I ask for it? And whose network would getting that job get me started in, looking for something rather better further down the road. But on the other hand, maybe you didn't need to look that much further down the road, because here's a second map I think you might have been interested in, which is how much will I get paid for being a London vicar? And the answer is a lot. Because outside the city, and I think the city would rather change this, but you can see that the average incomes here we're talking about include a number of extremely well-paid livings, given that the average income across the country is £285 a year. There are some here that get you over £1,000, quite a few that get you to the upper reaches of the hundreds. So the London clergy were not, on the whole, poor clergy in the Georgian era. And you could either hope to benefit this directly through getting one of these jobs, or if you were just starting out, you might want to be an assistant to one of these people, because given how much money they have, they can pay you a bigger salary as an assistant than anyone else. And these are curate stipends in London. And again, the national average is 81 quid. Well, on the whole, you could be getting over 150 in London as a curate here. And that's just your salary. Because you'll also get some income in many of these posts from the rites of passage. Every time someone gets married, every time someone is baptized, every time someone's buried, there are fees associated with these things. And those would add to your income too. So in the 18th century, a London clergyman might just look like a well-paid job. And that was a key compensation. When we did Patsy Kensett's Who Do You Think You Are, I spent a long time talking to her about her ancestor in Bethnal Green in the 1830s. And the programme inevitably focused on the downside of this, what a heavy workload the poor guy had. He was burying his own child on Christmas Day, and a pretty grim sense of the amount of effort he had to do, and his social work. And it presented the end of his career when he moves out to Buckinghamshire into the countryside as a kind of liberation, almost a kind of premature move to paradise from this urban hell that he'd been soldiering in. But I think that actually may be rather to underestimate the benefits that Joseph Mayne got from serving in the East End, because he was in the Bethnal Green, as Julian Merceron, who is here tonight, would tell you, of Joseph Merceron, which we've all been watching in Poldark recently. And Joseph Merceron had paid Mayne's vicar £10,000 to make himself scarce from the parish. £10,000 in the 1810s. And it's highly likely, I think, we didn't dare tell Patsy Kensit this because she was trying to escape from her family's history of organised crime, that Mayne was on the payroll as well, because when the vicar disappeared, Mayne remained the main person in the town, and was mercifully got rid of his main opponent. And there were benefits between fees and these opportunities. They weren't there if you were in the countryside. So you could make quite a decent living in the town. So if the Georgian idea, the London Cloak career, was one of urbane engagement with an elite, comfortable circumstances, and a prospect of advancement, how did that give way to the later Victorian perception of underpaid overwork and thankless exertion by marginal clerics? Now, some of the answers to that is a simple fact that the early 19th century urban setting expanded and became more challenging very, very quickly. One can tell a simple story of this forcing unavoidable change in clerical engagement on an often reluctant church. A more church-friendly model, preferred by many traditional church historians, stresses the importance of zeal, a new sensibility motivating a new kind of clergyman in the early 19th century to engage with the capital's poor. And all that's part of the story, but I don't think it tells the whole story, because the urban challenge and accession of zeal were both well established before 1850. And you might therefore expect something of this new understanding of urban ministry to be visible in the advice literature, by then even more commonplace than that we were looking at in the 18th century. But if we pick up the early or mid-19th century equivalents of the text we were looking at earlier, it's even more extraordinary how little the city figures, even once Chalmers's work had begun to influence the views of bishops and others to expand church buildings in the city. Take, for example, the two most famous such works published in the 19th century, Robert Evans's The Bishopric of Souls of 1842 and John James Blunt's The Duties of the Parish Priest, 1856, the career handbooks for a whole generation of Victorian clergy. Neither suggests anything distinctive about an approach to clerical ministry in the city. And Evans, in his entire book, uses the word town once. In 1807, John Randolph, the Bishop of London, the first bishop who actually did a proper inquiry into what was available in terms of churches and numbers of clergy in the city, a systematic inquiry into that, and so in a really important figure in that way, he compiled a clergyman's instructor, which was specifically intended to give practical advice for his clergy. And what's in it? Well, there's George Herbert, Jeremy Taylor, Edmund Gibson, their ilk from the 18th century before, the same text we were looking at before, all about an undifferentiated clergyman with no town concerns. And this work only uses the word town on 3 occasions, and not once when talking about pastoral work. And it was still being republished in its 6th edition in 1855. Even more striking is the fact that when works in the second half of the 19th century contrasted city and country, it was not always in the way we might anticipate. As late as 1855, William Holt Beaver's verdict in The Parson's Round of Duty in Town and Countryside was that it was infinitely easier to work in a city than it was in the countryside. And this is what he said: "Your field is more limited. No time's wasted in travel. Your forces are better organised and work from a centre. There's more stimulus. There's more opportunity in the crowd you have to deal with. You've got the possibility of free speech without the risk of apparent personality, a larger choice of staff, a greater variety of cases under treatment. Whereas the country, you have to attend to most things yourself. You have your time and chances often broken up or frittered away, and yourself run great risk of getting your spirit mildewed. Now, by that date, this cattle-breeding Herefordshire squire was an unrepresentative voice. From the 1860s, a new tone entered discussion. Andrew Boyd, an establishmentarian Church of Scotland minister, well connected south of the border, had moved from a rural post to take up a living in Edinburgh in the end of the 1850s. His gently complacent reflections on recreations of a country parson of 1861 featured a section on the parson's choice between town and country. And Boyd reminisced that as a student in the 1840s, he had coveted a town living's more eminent place and greater usefulness, but now the prospect made him doubt his capacity. By the following year, his leisure hours in town had to be prefaced by a warning that these might be scarce. It is the rule in large towns, so far as I've known them, that the clergy shall be overwrought. When a country parson leaving a rustic cure undertakes the charge of such a parish, if he be a man whose heart is in his work, he is quite certain greatly to overwork himself. It's indeed a total change from the quiet of a country parish, where dwellings are dotted singly here and there with great fields between them, to the town, where street after street of tall houses is filled with your parishioners, all entitled to some measure of your care and thought. And with that change comes a sudden acceleration of the wheels of life. You begin to live in a hurry. You must get your mind into a feverish state. You live under a constant feeling of pressure. You think, while you are doing anything, that something else is waiting to be done. A very modern vision of city life. Now, Boyd's appreciation of the pastoral challenge of the town was soon echoed by the ex-manufacturing chemist, the Reverend John Henry Blunt, whose Directorium Pastorale of 1864 could be read as a critique of Blunt's lectures a decade before. There has always been a preference for country parishes among the clergy, and of books that have been written on the subject of pastoral work, I hardly know any which at all deal with it as if England were a land of manufacturing and commercial towns as well as of agricultural villages. If it should be the lot of a clergyman to be cast in any town parish, let him consider that he has been placed in the vanguard of the army, which is fighting the Lord's battle against immorality and intellectual sin, and has had put into his hands the most hopeful material that can be found for building up a church of the future. And from such texts began a tradition of writing which by the 1890s and 1900s was producing context-specific guidance for city clergy. So finally, advice manuals began to catch up with what we now perceive as the reality of the city challenge. This development lagged significantly behind the emergence of that challenge and the application of zeal to city ministry among small cohorts of specialists, or the reports of the front line of those like Smedley, who found the going tough. Neither zeal or the objective challenge thus fully explains the timing of the change in perception of the urban clergyman. Now, how could identifying this 30-year time lag modify accounts of the Victorian Church's engagement with London as a city? I want to suggest two possible consequences. First, I think it's an important reminder to us not to read all the changes in the 19th century church of increased engagement in the town as a consequence of a response to industrial society in a caring, pastoral way, and understanding that there was a social challenge here. It was a response, I think, to a sense of an expanding, but not necessarily urban population, and to a fear that the church was losing its hold. But while major conurbations in new communities were addressed by the church's leadership, it's important, I think, not to import later concerns back into why people were worried about towns in the early 19th century. And I think what they were worried about then was radicalism. This was a political reaction, a concern that if you didn't engage with the town, the French Revolution would arise overnight. And that is why you get the London churches of St Pancras and others built so rapidly. That's what the war reparations that Britain gets paid after the Napoleonic Wars are spent on, building new churches in London. It was that and a concern with religious dissent, rather than the sense that the urban poor were in need of pastoral care, that pioneered the early initiatives in engagement with London. Secondly, one might ask what factors other than the objective challenge of the city and zeal for saving souls helped fashion and disseminate the new identity of the city clergyman and parish. How did it help clerics choose or not choose an urban career? And I think part of that story is one about novels and pictures. And I haven't yet really got very far with that bit of the story, but I think it is there. But I can offer some brief observations on initial preconditions in institutions about information flows and the capacity to make sense of those, which may have helped an understanding of the London Cloak challenge to emerge from the 1860s. Now, if the 1820s and 1830s did not see a new London cloacal identity emerge as clearly as we might have expected, these decades did at least create the conditions in which it could do so. First, changes in the regulation of clerical non-residence and the holding of more than one parish at the same time by one person encouraged a clearer separation between the rural and the city clergy. It remained possible for a man appointed before the 1838 Pluralities Act to maintain a dual identity, but it was still much harder than it had been before. And we can see this, for example, if you look at the livings held by the men appointed in the 1830s and 40s to the 10 new parishes then established in Bethnal Green. And compare it to the map we saw earlier, looking at the priorities of that selection of London clergymen. So in the 1840s, only one clergyman in Bethnal Green had a living anywhere else, and that was the vicar who'd been chased out by Joseph Merceron, who was still going, Joshua King, now living up in the Wirral, and a Tory fox hunting squire up there. So that was a big change. And at the same time, the new facility with which new churches could be built and later new districts or parishes carved out, along with the voluntary support for employing extra clergy, rapidly shifted the profile of employment opportunities in the church. Not only did this mean many more urban positions, but the failure to secure significant endowments for these new posts meant that the character of the urban posting changed from being a rich posting to being a comparatively poor one. Before 1830, the fees and other perks generated by an urban parish could give a decent living, even when the endowment was weak. After 1830, not only were district ministers forced to survive on a minimal endowment and a fraction of the fees formerly available, but incumbents too could lose money as new parishes were carved out from among their own big parishes, and they therefore lost the income associated with the marriages or baptisms that took place in these other districts. Under Bishop Blomfield in the 1830s and 1840s and his successors, London clergy were encouraged to use or demanded to use any spare cash to employ extra clergy rather than spending it on themselves to try and cope with the challenge of the city. So that cut your income. And from the outset, the people who went to work in these new poorly paid positions were very different, not least because they were increasingly appointed by the bishops themselves, who were among those most likely to take on the new message about what needed to be done in the city. Again, notably Charles James Bloomfield of London. And partly through necessity, but also I suspect through choice, the clerics they selected tended to be rather less traditional in their social makeup than those that had previously held these positions. And again, Bethnal Green is instructive here. This slide shows the birth and ordinations of the Bethnal Green incumbents in post in 1845. They come from cities and big towns, Leeds, Ripon, the industrial centres of the north, Australia in some cases, Canada. These aren't the same kind of people who were the classic Anglican clergy of the past. These are people brought in here. And there's more than two ex-colonial clergy, and I guess that a lot of ex-colonial clergy came back and worked in towns in Britain. And that wasn't simply because they were marginal. I think there was a sense in which the experience you'd had if you'd been a frontier clergyman in Australia was seen as highly relevant if you came back to the ganglands of Bethnal Green, that some of the same sorts of challenges might be facing. So Joseph Keane comes from the Australian outback to become one of the Bethnal Green clergy here. So one or two others come out of the armed forces, ex-soldiers. There's a wonderful letter, again, about Bethnal Green, where someone's dealing with the cholera epidemic in 1848 as a cleric, and he says, "I've not seen anything like this since I was on board the quarterdeck of a boat in the Napoleonic Wars, watching men being blown up all around me." They have that sense that they're on a front line, and they bring frontline experience with them. Non-graduates, often on meagre salaries. Some clergy in Bethnal Green remained on a financial knife edge, at least one of them being imprisoned for debt. And this insecurity bred a distinctive dependence on congregations, rather like that often seen in Irish Catholic clergy, and a pastoral style, therefore, geared up to working with the poor, because you needed their contributions to make ends meet. And that, I think, helped build the new model of ministry. And those developments complicated the employment choices made by new clergy of those seeking to move in ways that encouraged specialisation. And you can see an aspect of that process, I think, in the changes in the presentation of information relating to parishes which a clerical job seeker could get access to. Now, in the 18th century, clerics seeking job specifications would first have turned to this book, John Ecton's Rerum Ecclesiasticum Thesaurus, which offers key information for every Church of England parish on patronage and how much money you'll make if you get the job, based on historic sources. And those are the two key things you probably wanted to know. You're looking about where your next job might come from. But from 1817, the Clerical Guided Directory listed the population of the parish before any other considerations. You can now get it from the census, of course. And in the 1835 report of the Ecclesiastical Commission, not only was there further information on the extent of church accommodation, but up-to-date figures for incomes. By the time of the appearance in 1841 of the clergy list, these publications were giving lists of the teams of curates attached to large urban livings. And this made the challenge, the scale of the help you're going to get if you get these jobs much more visible than it ever would have been before. And I think this made it much easier for clergy to know what they were taking on if they came to a new London church. And it also provided the basis for a more analytical account of the range and scale of different types of parish postings available. And thus the identification of the contours of the urban challenge was becoming perceptible long before the 1851 census offered its own take on the particular challenges. So if these new materials were available for analysis, it may also be suggested, finally, that in the 1860s, there were new approaches to doing that analysis as well. And thus it may be argued that the emergence of a distinctive idea of the urban or city or London clergyman owed as much to developments in taxonomy and indeed a nascent kind of sociology of the clergy as anything to do with the actual challenges that people faced. And if you look at the final destinations of the Bethnal Green clergy we discussed a minute ago, we've seen that many of them did indeed go on to become country parsons. But if you actually read the accounts of town clergy emerging by this date, it's beginning clear that people think this is a different kind of job that wouldn't equip you for the challenges you'd get if you moved on to these other places. In short, from the late 1850s, a primitive sociology of the clerical profession emerges. And it's noticeable in a number of areas, and so a whole number of people trying to write what are the different types of clergymen there are. And probably the most famous and successful person for this was Anthony Trollope. Not as we tend to think of it in those Barchester novels, where he perfectly captures the world of the English rural clergyman, and brilliantly, having worked on that period for a long time, his ear for slang and the way it changes, even to the decade in which he's writing those books, is absolutely extraordinary. But in 1864-5, he writes a series of essays for the Pall Mall Gazette on clergymen of the Church of England. And in this, he has a very sharp eye for the city scene. One of his essays is entitled The Town Incumbent. And it's notable not only for identifying clearly the workload and pressures associated with urban ministry, but for deliberately eschewing that word parson. He doesn't use that. So it's a different kind of job, this. You're going to have different things. You're an incumbent. And you begin to see more and more people talking about that from the early 1850s. So I think it could be argued that at least as much as advice manuals, professional texts such as we've been discussing earlier, it was these kind of discussions in the press or in Punch, then argued over in the newspapers or the periodical press, that gave clergy a model of what it meant to become a learned clergyman and face the challenges there by the end of the century. It's time to stop. But I hope in what I've said tonight, I've at least managed to convince you that not only that Edward Smedley's apparently conventional take on town and country in 1821 was actually rather a pioneering one, seeing the town as potentially more challenging than the countryside, but more generally, the story of how the urbane cleric of Georgian England was transformed into the urban minister of later Victorian London was not simply the story of the church facing up to a self-evident pastoral challenge. It's rather, I'd suggest, a story which deserves further investigation. And who knows, perhaps the country parson too might benefit from a bit more committed scrutiny. But that's a task, I think, for another evening. Thank you very much.